Okay, so Taiwan, right? You've seen the headlines, military drills, microchips, superpowers. It's a lot to keep up with.
It really is.
But that's why we're here today, to go deep on Taiwan, figure out why everybody's making such a fuss about this island.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study.
Absolutely. And to help us connect the dots, we have an expert here who can help us see the big picture. You ready to get into it?
Let's do it.
All right, so first things first, let's just visualize this, right? You've got a map, and right in the middle of some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, you've got Taiwan.
You got it. It's like this ultimate strategic choke point right in the middle of these crucial straits. The Taiwan Strait, the Miyako Strait up north, and the Bashi Strait further south. These are like maritime highways, not just for trade, but for military movement too.
Okay, so that's interesting, and we have all these reports about China ramping up military drills. They're showing off their new aircraft carrier. Are they just flexing, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely more than just flexing their muscles. You know, we've got this Chinese diplomat, Victor Gao, and he says pretty bluntly that Taiwan Island faces the Pacific directly, and if Taiwan is occupied by a foreign country, it interrupts the continuity of the Chinese coastline and also prevents the Chinese access directly to the Pacific Ocean. So you can see it's a big deal for them.
So they're trying to break free of what the U.S. calls the first island chain.
Yeah, exactly. The first island chain. Picture like a line of U.S. allies and partners stretching from Japan down to the Philippines. The U.S. uses it to, project power in the region, and China sees it as a barrier.
So it's like a big game of Risk with Taiwan as the prize.
Yeah, you could think about it like that. And this isn't just about, military stuff either. It has real-world impacts.
Well, yeah, how so?
I mean, look at the quote from David Sachs, an expert from the Council on Foreign Relations. He points out that if you look at the first island chain, these are all formal treaty allies of the United States, or close partners in the case of Taiwan. And with that, the way it is, the United States can project power close to China's shores, protect its allies and its interests. So control of Taiwan would really shake things up.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does all of this first island chain business affect me sitting here listening to this?
Well, think about it this way. Disruptions in that region could impact a lot of things. The price of electronics, for example, or the stability of global trade. Think back to the supply chain issues we all had to deal with recently. Imagine that on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, that's a good point. And speaking of electronics, can we talk about Taiwan's role in the tech world? I mean, this tiny island produces a huge amount of the world's most advanced microchips, right? It's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. And it all comes down to one company, TSMC. They make something like 90% of the world's most advanced microchips. The ones that power everything from smartphones to, cutting-edge AI. You're probably using a TSMC chip right now to listen to us.
So Taiwan's got the keys to the future of tech.
You could say that, and that's what worries the U.S. Losing access to those chips would be a big blow to their economy and their technological edge.
Right. I remember David Sachs had something to say about China wanting the U.S. to just be a supplier of raw materials, something like that.
Yeah, he did. And it really gets to the heart of China's ambitions. They don't just want to be the world's factory, they want to be the leader in technology. And Taiwan's chips would be a huge step towards that goal.
It's not just about the chips themselves, but who controls the future of technology.
Right. And Victor Gao even said that the U.S. economy is actually already smaller than China's if you factor in purchasing power parity.
Okay, hold on. Purchasing power parity.
It's basically a way of comparing economies that takes into account the cost of living in different countries. So it levels the playing field and shows how much people can actually buy with their money. And by that measure, China's already bigger than the U.S.
That's interesting. So we've got this strategic tug-of-war, this battle for tech dominance, but something tells me there's more to it, right? It goes deeper than that.
You're right. To really get what's at stake, we need to go back in time, untangle the history between China and Taiwan.
Okay, so let's rewind. We're talking about the Chinese Civil War, right? Communists versus nationalists back in 1949.
That's right. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, took over mainland China. And the defeated nationalists fled to, well, you guessed it, Taiwan. So you ended up with two governments claiming to be the real China.
Wow. Two Chinas, one island. So how did the rest of the world deal with that?
Well, for a while, the U.S. actually recognized the government in Taiwan as the legitimate government of all of China. But then in the 1970s, they switched sides and recognized the communist government in Beijing.
And what about Taiwan? Did it just disappear?
Not at all. The U.S. still has unofficial ties with Taiwan, providing weapons and supporting their democracy. It's created this really complicated situation called the One China policy.
One China policy. I've heard that phrase, but I'm not really sure what it means.
Basically, it means that officially there's only one China.
Yeah.
But who gets to be that one China is the question. The U.S. acknowledges China's claim over Taiwan, but they don't actually endorse it. It's intentionally vague.
So they're trying not to upset anyone.
Exactly. But there's another layer of history here that we need to understand, the century of humiliation.
Century of humiliation. That sounds heavy.
It is. It refers to a period in Chinese history starting in the mid-19th century when China was invaded, exploited, and humiliated by foreign powers. They lost territory, they were forced to sign unfair treaties, and their national pride was shattered.
And how does Taiwan fit into this?
Well, during that time, China also lost control of Taiwan to Japan. So for many Chinese people, reclaiming Taiwan isn't just about territory. It's about restoring China's greatness and righting a historical wrong.
So this century of humiliation is still influencing China's actions today.
Absolutely. It's a powerful narrative that the Chinese Communist Party uses to rally support and legitimize its rule. They argue that only they can restore China to its rightful place in the world.
And Xi Jinping seems pretty set on making that happen.
He does. An expert named Bonnie Glaser describes Xi as a leader of, world historic importance. He views himself in a very similar way, I think, to Vladimir Putin, that he's just not a run-of-the-mill leader. He's transformative. For Xi, taking back Taiwan would be a major achievement.
So is he willing to go to war for it? Because Victor Gao made it pretty clear that no one, no country, no single human being will be able to block the peaceful reunification of China or the non-peaceful reunification of China. So we should call on the United States, don't play with fire.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong statement.
Definitely. But let's not forget that there are millions of people living in Taiwan. What about their perspective?
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in all the geopolitics and forget about the human element.
Exactly.
Really?
We can talk all day about strategic this and microchips that, but what's it actually like to live in Taiwan with this threat hanging over you?
Well, we've got some insights from Yuchen Li, a journalist based in Taiwan. And it turns out daily life goes on. People are used to living with the threat from China, but they're also very proud of their democracy and their way of life.
So they're not just sitting around waiting for someone else to decide their fate.
Not at all. They're building their own society, one that values freedom, innovation, and human rights. And that's actually what makes Taiwan so threatening to the Chinese Communist Party.
Because it challenges their way of thinking.
Exactly. Taiwan's success is a real-world example of democracy working. And it contradicts the idea that Chinese culture can't be democratic. If Taiwan can thrive as a free and open society, it undermines the legitimacy of one-party rule in China.
Interesting. So it's more than just land or even the economy. It's about ideas, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes this conflict even more complicated and potentially dangerous. It's a clash of worldviews, a struggle between two very different ways of organizing society. And, it's not just about Taiwan either. David Sachs said that you would have deep questions being asked in South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines on whether they can rely on the United States for their security.
So if Taiwan falls, it could have a domino effect across the whole region.
Exactly. It would send a message that authoritarianism is winning and democracy is losing. It could embolden other authoritarian regimes and make the U.S. look weak.
Yeah.
The consequences would be huge.
Okay, this is getting intense. But before we go any further, let's hear more about what life is like for the people in Taiwan. What did Yuchen Li find out in those interviews?
One thing that stood out to me was how normal life feels amidst all this tension. People are going about their daily routines, raising families, running businesses. The threat from China is there, but they've learned to live with it.
Like living next to a volcano.
Yeah.
It could erupt, but you can't let it control your life.
Exactly. And there's a real sense of resilience, too. Taiwan has faced challenges before, and they've always come out stronger. Remember, they transitioned from authoritarian rule to a thriving democracy, something that many people thought was impossible.
So they're not just passive bystanders in this global power struggle. They're actively shaping their own destiny.
Exactly. And that's what makes Taiwan such a problem for the Chinese Communist Party. Their success goes against everything the CCP stands for.
Okay, I'm starting to see why everyone's so focused on Taiwan.
Yeah.
But let's hear more about those everyday lives. What did the people Yuchen Li interviewed have to say?
Well, their voices are incredibly powerful. Some feel they need the U.S. for protection, others are unsure about American involvement. But a lot of them just want peace and stability and the ability to decide their own future.
So there's a whole range of opinions within Taiwan itself.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Taiwan has its own identity, its own culture, its own history. They're not just a piece in a bigger game. They're a nation of people with their own hopes and dreams.
Okay, that's a good reminder. It's easy to get lost in the abstract ideas and forget that there are real people involved.
And their lives shouldn't be sacrificed for political gain or grand narratives.
Well said. But speaking of narratives, can we talk about the bigger picture here? What are the underlying ideas clashing in this fight over Taiwan?
It's about more than just territory, right? Taiwan represents different ways of seeing the world: democracy versus one-party rule capitalism versus China's socialist market economy. It's a symbolic battleground for the future of Asia and maybe even the world.
Okay, so it's about ideas about systems of government, about ways of life. That's pretty heavy stuff.
It is, and it's something we need to understand if we want to grasp the true depth of this conflict.
All right, I'm ready to keep going. What's next on our list?
Let's look at what could happen if Taiwan were to fall under China's control. David Sachs paints a pretty bleak picture, saying that if China were to invade and annex Taiwan, we would see that democracy extinguished, and it could send chilling effects to democracies around the world.
So the stakes are even higher than we thought.
They are, and the implications go far beyond Taiwan itself. It's about the balance of power in Asia, the future of democracy, and the kind of world we want to live in.
Okay, this is a lot to take in, but I'm definitely getting a clearer picture of why this tiny island is causing such a global storm. We've covered a lot of ground here: maps and military drills, microchips, historical grievances. Where do we even go from here?
I think a good next step is to shift gears a bit and explore what life is actually like for the people living in Taiwan, because at the end of the day, their voices are the ones that matter most.
Absolutely. Let's hear what they have to say.
You know, it's interesting how the world sees Taiwan, through this lens of geopolitics, but for the people who actually live there, it's just home.
Right. It's like we're talking about these abstract, forces, but they're real people with real lives. So tell me more about those lives. What did Yu Shenli find out in these interviews?
Well, one thing that really stood out to me was this sense of normalcy amidst all the tension. People are going about their daily routines, they're raising families, they're running businesses. The threat from China is always there, but it's just become part of life.
It's like living next to a volcano.
Yeah.
It could erupt at any moment, but you can't let that fear paralyze you.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this real sense of resilience, too. Taiwan has faced challenges before, and they've always come out stronger. They transitioned from authoritarian rule to a thriving democracy, which a lot of people didn't think was possible.
So they're just sitting around waiting for their fate to be decided.
Not at all. They're shaping their own destiny. They're building a society that values freedom, innovation, and human rights. And that's actually what makes Taiwan so threatening to the Chinese Communist Party.
Because it challenges their whole narrative.
Exactly. Taiwan's success is a direct challenge to the CCP's claim that Chinese culture and democratic values are incompatible. If Taiwan can be a free and open society and thrive, it undermines the legitimacy of one-party rule in China.
That's a really interesting point. So it's not just about the land or even the economy. It's about ideology, too.
Absolutely. It makes this conflict even more complex and potentially dangerous. It's like a clash of civilizations, a battle between two very different ways of organizing a society. And David Sachs even pointed out that this could have a ripple effect. He said, you would have deep questions being asked in South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines on whether they can rely on the United States for their security.
Oh, wow. So if Taiwan falls, it could impact the whole region.
Exactly. It could embolden other authoritarian regimes and weaken the U.S.'s position in the region. The consequences could be really serious.
Okay, so we've got escalating tensions, potential for conflict. Those are some pretty scary scenarios. What about a peaceful resolution? Is that even possible?
Well, the most likely scenario, at least in the short term, is that things stay pretty much the same. Taiwan keeps its independence in practice, China keeps up the pressure, but neither side does anything too drastic to trigger a war.
It's like a stalemate, a standoff.
Yeah, you could say that, but it's a delicate balance and it can't last forever. Sooner or later, something's got to give.
So what are the other options? What could happen?
Well, one possibility is that China decides to ratchet up the pressure without actually invading. They could impose a naval blockade, for example, or step up military exercises in a way that disrupts Taiwan's economy and everyday life.
And how would the U.S. and other countries react to that?
That's the big question. Would the U.S. actually risk a war with China to defend Taiwan? Would other countries get involved? It would be a huge test of alliances and global power dynamics. And honestly, it's hard to say how it would play out.
So this could be a major turning point in global politics.
It could. It could reshape the balance of power in Asia and maybe even the world. And the outcome would have a huge impact on the future of democracy and global order.
Okay, so increased tensions, possible conflict.
Yeah.
Those are some pretty grim possibilities. What about peaceful reunification? Is that something that could happen?
Well, China's definitely floated that idea. They've proposed this one country, two systems model, kind of like they have in Hong Kong.
Didn't that one country, two systems thing not work out so well in Hong Kong, though?
Yeah, it didn't. The crackdown on pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong pretty much shattered any hope that China would allow Taiwan to keep its freedoms if they reunified.
So that option's probably off the table for now. What about the Taiwanese people? What do they want?
That's the key question. And polls show that most Taiwanese people want to maintain the status quo. They don't want to be ruled by China, but they also don't want to start a war. They want peace and freedom.
But is that even realistic in the long run? Can this balance last forever?
That's the challenge, right? The status quo is getting harder and harder to maintain. The pressure is building, and at some point, something has to give. But finding a solution that respects the will of the Taiwanese people and prevents a major conflict is incredibly difficult.
It's like we're all stuck in this geopolitical limbo with no easy way out. It's kind of like a game of chicken where everyone's hoping someone else will back down first, but the consequences of a crash are terrifying.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the nuances of this situation. We need to avoid oversimplifying things, and we need to recognize the human cost of any potential conflict. This isn't just about geopolitical maneuvering, it's about the lives of millions of people.
You know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. We've got history, strategic rivalries, economics, ideology. It's a lot.
It is, but I think we've made some progress in understanding it. We've looked at the history, the strategic factors, the economics, and most importantly, we've heard from the Taiwanese people themselves.
And those voices are the ones that should guide us moving forward.
Absolutely. Their desire for peace, freedom, and self-determination should be at the center of any discussion about Taiwan's future.
Okay, I think that's a good place to pause for now. This has been a really eye-opening conversation. What are some of the key things you think our listeners should take away from this part of the episode?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the situation in Taiwan is constantly evolving. It's fluid and unpredictable. So it's important to stay informed and be open to different perspectives.
And to avoid thinking that there's one simple solution.
Exactly. This is a complex issue with no easy answers. But by understanding the history, the competing interests, and the human stories behind the headlines, we can start to make more informed judgments and advocate for policies that promote peace and stability.
Okay, so stay informed, think critically, and don't forget about the human element. Great advice. Are you ready to move on to the final part of our deep dive?
Let's do it. It's time to explore what the future might hold for Taiwan and how the international community can help shape that future.
So we've spent all this time really unpacking, the situation in Taiwan. Its history, the geopolitics, the people caught in the middle. It's a lot.
It is, but I think understanding these different pieces, as we've tried to do, is really important for anyone who wants to understand, why Taiwan matters on a global scale.
I agree. So where do we go from here? What can we do with all of this information?
Well, one thing that struck me, throughout our conversation is how easy it is to slip into this us versus them thinking. But even within Taiwan, there are a lot of different opinions.
Right. Yu Chenli's interviews really show that some people want closer ties with the U.S. Some are wary of it, and some just want to be left alone.
Yeah, and that's something we have to remember when we talk about, potential solutions. The Taiwanese people deserve a voice. They shouldn't be pawns in some bigger game.
It's like that saying, nothing about us without us. But realistically, how much agency do they have with these two superpowers, looming over them?
That's a tough question. Honestly, there's no easy answer. But I think it's important to remember that Taiwan has defied expectations before. Their transition to democracy was incredible. A lot of people didn't think it was possible.
So there's still hope, even in this situation.
I think so. And one way we can support that is by amplifying the voices of the Taiwanese people, letting them tell their own stories, share their hopes and fears.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about the international community? What role can they play? Is it just a matter of watching and waiting, or are there things that can be done to de-escalate the situation?
Well, the first thing is to make it absolutely clear to both China and the U.S. that a military conflict would be a disaster for everyone. We're not talking about some theoretical war game here. The human and economic costs would be enormous.
Yeah, and not just for those directly involved, right? We saw what happened with supply chains during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Imagine that on a much larger scale.
Exactly. And then there's the risk of it spreading beyond the Taiwan Strait, potentially drawing in other countries and escalating out of control.
Okay, so preventing conflict is the top priority. What else?
Supporting Taiwan's democracy and their right to decide their own future. That's key. It doesn't necessarily mean recognizing them as an independent country, but it does mean treating them with respect, giving them a voice in international organizations, and making sure they can defend themselves.
So making sure Taiwan is strong and resilient.
Right. And finally, the international community needs to encourage dialogue between Taiwan and the U.S. I know it sounds kind of cliche, but talking is always better than fighting.
It's easier said than done, though, right? With all the history and the ideological differences, it seemed pretty hard to get everyone to sit down and have a productive conversation.
It is. But that doesn't mean we should give up on diplomacy. It's the only way to find a lasting and peaceful solution.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. As we wrap up, what are some things our listeners should keep in mind as they, learn more about Taiwan and its future?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed and to be critical of the information you come across. There's a lot of propaganda and misinformation out there, so it's important to check different sources, to question your own assumptions, and to be open to changing your mind as you learn more.
Like we said, this situation is constantly changing. What's true today might not be true tomorrow. So keep learning, keep questioning, and stay engaged. We started this episode by talking about the tiny microchip that's probably powering the device you're using to listen to us. And that microchip, in a way, it's like a symbol of Taiwan. It represents their technological strength, their strategic importance, and their vulnerability.
Wow. It's a reminder that global events aren't just headlines. They have real impacts on all of us, even if we don't realize it.
So next time you pick up your phone or your laptop or whatever, take a second to think about the island where that microchip might have come from. It's a powerful symbol of Taiwan's story, a story of resilience, innovation, and the struggle for peace and freedom in an increasingly complex world.
And it's a story that's not finished yet. The choices we make today will shape Taiwan's future and maybe even the future of the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new, and we encourage you to keep exploring this issue. It's complex, it's fascinating, and it matters. Until next time, stay curious.